I debated this morning whether to continue in with 1 Peter or to kind of focus on the resurrection. I'm going to do both, because that's what I do. Whenever I have to decide what to do, I do everything. And I haven't learned my lesson yet. But no, really, as I was going through this, we're just looking at one verse this morning, and it's really kind of a continuation from Daniel's message last week in 1 Peter 5:5. But you can see the title I gave it. It kind of gives away the whole ending, so you can now drone out and just, when I say amen, pay attention again. But the reality of the humility of Christ needs to happen first, and it leads us to the exaltation of Christ. So what we celebrate this morning is the exaltation of Christ, but you can't just show up on Resurrection Sunday and hear the story. You have to know the whole story, and that I'm thankful, Julie, that you even bringing us back to were you there, right? The Good Friday. I always think about that. We call it Good Friday. It wasn't good for Jesus, but it was good for us, and it was that humility of Him. So let me just read that verse for you. It's just, again, one verse, 1 Peter 5:5. And starts with you younger men. Actually, no, I'm going to read verses 1 through 5, because we need a little context. Therefore, I exhort the elders among you, as your fellow elder and witness of the sufferings of Christ. Just catch there, Peter witnessed the sufferings of Christ, and that was part of his authentication. And a partaker also of the glory that is to be revealed. Shepherd the flock of God among you, exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but voluntarily, according to the will of God, and not for sordid gain or filthy lucre, which is a cooler phrase, but with eagerness, nor yet as lording it over those allotted to your charge, but proving to be examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the unfading crown of glory. And then to our verse this morning, you younger men likewise be subject to your elders, and all of you clothe yourselves with humility toward one another. For God is opposed to the proud, but gives grace to the humble. So last week Daniel talked about that charge that we have. We've been given by God as a charge, and here Peter in this context was talking specifically to the elders of a church, and we just had our elders retreat this weekend. So we looked at that verse, and we really talked about a lot and prayed about the charge that God had given us. But as Daniel was pointing out, we all have a charge. It may not be of a church. It might be of a family. It might be of a younger sibling. It might be of co-workers, the sphere of influence that God has given you. We all have this charge, and how do we do that well and faithfully? But this week, the other side of that is not only the charge that we have, but I think all of us, we are also in someone else's charge. We have the sense of being kind of under somebody else, another authority. And so I want to talk about that other side of it. And in other words, you could say it this way. If last week Daniel's was about how to be a godly leader in the church or in your life, this week is how to be a godly follower in a church or in your family. And you might be asking, well, what on earth does this have to do with the resurrection? And hopefully we'll get to that. What does this have to do with Jesus overcoming death and giving us hope and life and a home? That's what we're celebrating this morning. Hopefully you'll see as we get to the end how those questions will come together. So first of all, we're going to talk about how to be in someone else's charge, to use the phrase that Daniel used last week. So these are things that come from the first 4 verses from last week. The first thing you think about being in a charge, being in someone else's charge, this statement that you may have heard, to be a good leader, you must first be a good follower. Maybe you've heard that statement. And this follows in that same vein. As the leaders are to lead, then the followers are to follow in the same way. So verse 5 says, you younger men, likewise. So in the same way is what that means. The same way that the leaders are leading, the followers should be following. And so as I was looking through that, what does that mean and look like? Even looking at those first 4 verses, There we go. So as the elders are to exercise oversight, the people in the church should be open to oversight. And if you might remember a few Sundays ago when we prayed for and commissioned our new elders, before we prayed for them, I said, now remember what this means. Just know that this means is that we're giving these elders, the elders, permission to speak into our lives and to shepherd us, right? It's hard to shepherd people that don't want to be shepherded, right? Because they kind of keep going to other places. So as someone who you say, hey, I'm open to oversight. Doesn't mean you're going to control my whole life, right? But it means that I am open to getting input from other people. Now I can tell you, there are ways to learn things in life. You can learn from your own mistakes, and those are very memorable. You can also learn from other people's mistakes, and that's great. That's called seeking wisdom from people. So you don't have to make all the mistakes yourself. So being open to oversight. Secondly, just like the elders are not to serve under compulsion, so also the people in the church should be responding to Christ through the directions of the leader. If that makes sense. So you're not the leaders shouldn't be like, I have to do this, but as a follower you also shouldn't be saying, I have to do this. You're responding to Christ. Christ is offering an invitation. You know, the resurrection, what we celebrate this morning, is not the end of the story. It's actually the beginning. It's the very beginning. I think it was just last year. I plan on doing it this year too. After resurrection, I started reading the book of Acts. And I just read a chapter a day. Because the book of Acts then begins to unfold what happened after the resurrection. And you see that it's the resurrection of Christ was really just the beginning of that story. And so there's the sense of we are responding to what Christ is doing in our life. Also, just like the elders are to serve voluntarily, so the people in the church should willingly be submitting to direction and correction. Again, this is according to God's will. It's not really about the leaders. It's God working through the leaders and allowing God to work in your life through other people. And this is just so... I almost want to say this is so revolutionary because we're Americans. And we just think we should do everything on our own, and no one can tell me what to do, and I have my independence, and I have my freedom. And we should, thank God for those things that we have, but we do have to recognize that for really a healthy life, and I would say in the church, that when we are under the direction and the correction of people who love us and care for us, it goes well for us. And this all starts to think about it's the concept of a family, the building block of a family. Why did God design families? For protection and care. You know, God could have done it any way He wanted, right? We could have just been. We could be like born like on trees, right, and fall off, hit the ground, and then we just start walking around, and we have no family, and we do our own thing. But every person, not all families are as healthy or whole, but every person is born into some version of a family. And that is by God's design. That is good. So to be willing to that for that. So just like the elders are not to be looking out for that filthy lucre, so that people in church should not be asking, what's in it for me? Well, how is this helpful for me? What do you have to give me? But really asking, how can I serve? How can I serve? We have a lot of fights in our disagreements maybe in our household about our chore chart. We have a chore chart. It's very elaborate, if you can imagine. It looks like a spreadsheet. It's color-coded. It's very pretty. And every kid has their own color. And so, there's things to do before every meal and after every meal. And here's what happens. Sometimes somebody's not there. They're not at home. And so that chore needs to be done. And this is the phrase that I hear that really probably gives me into a rant, where someone says, that's not my chore. That's not my chore. Okay, well, how can I serve the family? What does the family need? Well, the family needs someone to set the table. So does it matter if it's your day, if that's your chore or not? No, it doesn't, right? So that's the attitude to flip around. It's the same thing that the leaders are to serve voluntarily, well, so are the followers as well. Okay, so this one. Elders are supposed to serve eagerly, and so we should be the first to volunteer. Again, going back to the chore chart example. Not to be reminded 84 times. I just made that number up randomly. I didn't count, but it might be accurate. As the elders are not to lord over the church, so the people in the church should not make it their hobby to give the elders a hard time. Right? I can say as elders, we know we've got problems. You don't need to remind us. I can say as parents, we know we got problems. You don't need to remind us. I can say as humans, we know we got problems. You don't need to remind us. What we need is encouragement. We need people to help us do the work of the Lord, what the Lord has called us to do. And I'm putting this in all sorts of contexts, right? So find a new hobby, if that's your hobby. And then lastly, from that part, as elders are charged to be examples, so the people in church should be seeking to learn from examples. Again, this is the attitude of being a learner, of recognizing, wow, there are people who do something really well, and I want to learn from them. And I would just tell you, if you want to grow in your prayer life, think, who do I know who is really good at praying? And then just go pray with them. Say, hey, can I meet with you and pray with them? Who do you know who's really good at evangelism, at sharing their faith in their life? Just ask if you can spend some time with them. Even go to the grocery store with them and see how they do it. Seek to learn from examples of people, of godly people, of more mature believers in your life. And that would be a good thing. So this is all about someone else's charge. So in the same way you want to be treated. That's the first thing you want to do. The second one is to be subject. And now we're in our specific verse, verse 5. To be subject, to submit yourselves. Now this is instructed to younger men, but just like last week we could look at elders and say, okay, there's a principle here that we can extrapolate. Everyone has some sort of charge and some sort of leadership. So too, this command here to young men, actually it's to younger, is literally what the Greek says, is to the younger, can be extrapolated out to include all those newer in the faith. So I found that was really, really interesting. It's literally just says the younger. So think about those recently born. Think about it spiritually. So recently spiritually born, young, youthful. And so we're not talking here about, the elders don't necessarily have to be the oldest people in the room, but they should be spiritually mature. And likewise, the younger in the church, we're not talking about those who are hanging out in the nursery, but we're talking about those who have most recently accepted Christ. So I want you to think a little less about, our physical age on this planet, and think more about how long have I been walking with Jesus, and how long have I been learning from him. And so we're thinking about that as a younger, and all of us could put ourselves in that category. Who do you know who's walked with the Lord more than you have, longer than you have? And there are almost always you can think of somebody. When you get to the end of your life, it gets a little harder, but you can always find that person who's been walking even longer than you have in the Lord. And then we're called to do this to submit ourselves under that wisdom. And again, that's just a good thing to do in life. To submit ourselves under wisdom. Again, otherwise we're going to be learning all the mistakes ourselves. And that's just a hard way to go through life. So put yourself under willingly, voluntarily put yourself under someone with more wisdom, with more spiritual experience than you have. And not to do it under compulsion. So, you younger men, likewise, be subject to your elders, and all of you, so now, even if you disagreed with me, which you shouldn't have before, this is all of you, he says, clothe yourselves with humility. Oh, there's a couple points there. You got those. And to the next one. Clothe yourselves with humility. That's number 3 when I get it up there eventually. Will it help? There it is. Thank you. Clothe yourselves with humility. Now, this was really fascinating when I dug into this a little bit. Clothe yourselves. There's a lot of times in Scripture we're told to put on certain things. Actually, you're told to put on Christ. Here, this is literally talking about a type of clothing, and the word originated from a knot or a band by which two things were fastened together, which seems a little strange. But the reason that came about is that was actually the band that was used, that usually slaves would use and wear. So this was additional information I found in the outline of biblical usage. They said this was the white scarf or apron of slaves. So this word, when it says clothe yourselves, this is talking about. So the white scarf or apron of slaves, which was fastened to the belt of the vest and distinguished slaves from freemen. So therefore, 1 Peter 5:5, gird yourselves with humility as your servile garb, encourages Christians to show their subjection one to another by putting on humility. It could also refer to the overalls which the slaves wore to keep clean while working, an exceedingly humble garment. So think about that. You're literally putting on this garment of humility. Think about putting on your work clothes. But I want you to go back to the last night that Jesus spent with his disciples. I don't know if this struck memory to you. They were sitting around the table, and Jesus got up. It's John 13:5. He poured water into the basin, and he began to wash the disciples' feet and wipe them with a towel. I'd never caught this before. With which he was girded. He literally clothed himself with humility. This was before the cross. He was going to the cross. And he laid that example for his disciples of girding himself with humility, with the servant's garb. And so you think about how Christ did that, how he led the example. Now, as we continue on in this verse, we get to this motivation. So again, verse 5, you younger men likewise be subject to your elders. All of you clothe yourselves with humility toward one another. For, here's our motivation. Why should we do this? Because, or for, God is opposed to the proud. That's our first motivation. If you want to be proud, that means that God is against you. Okay, so that is not a place any of us want to be. You do not want God against you. God battles against the proud. He resists the proud. If you want to just think about how Jesus dealt with the Pharisees, who thought that, they're like, we protect the law, we are the protectors of God, we do everything right. Remember the Pharisee who prayed and said, Lord, I thank you that I'm not like this tax collector. Think of all the things that Jesus said to the Pharisees. There's a passage in Scripture, I call it the woe to you passage. I think there's 7 of them. He says, woe to you. He's talking to the Pharisees. Woe to you. These are not the things you want God or Jesus to say to you. You do not want to ever be in a place where God is saying, woe to you. And in that place is those who are proud. God opposes the proud. So, do we know what pride looks like? I think we all do. I think we know what pride looks like. I don't want to necessarily give you examples because I feel like I have way too many in my own life. I think pride is any time that you are thinking about yourself. Anytime you are thinking, I could do that better. Anytime that you look at someone else and you say, oh man, I'm glad I'm not like that. And I know most of us don't ever say that out loud, but it's those thoughts in our mind. So to recognize that God opposes the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. He gives grace to the humble. I love this description of humility, which I got from, again, Blue Letter Bible. That which is low and does not rise far from the ground. Metaphorically, it's so lowly of no degree. So, I am not a gardener, if you guys know me, but we're trying to garden this year, and we have little seedlings growing in our house, and they sprouted up, and then when they get too tall, and they start kind of flopping down on the ground. And that's what I was getting a picture of. Like, even as you start to grow, you realize, oh no, not stray too far from your roots might be another way to say that. You're not getting too high and mighty, too full of yourself. It says God is opposed to the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. He gives grace to the humble. So I want us to look at the humility of Christ, because in this morning where we celebrate the glory of Christ, we cannot separate that from Good Friday. In fact, Pastor Jens, we did this service together, and he said that, the Good Friday service, it seems kind of weird because it's you leave and you're supposed to leave in silence, and it feels really incomplete, and that's on purpose, because it's actually one service from Good Friday till this morning. It's one continuous service, and they cannot be separated. So we love the celebration, we love the victory, but it comes through the humility. And so I just want to share with you, read for you, really probably I feel like a verse. If I went back and looked at my sermon notes for the last 10 years, and I looked at all the verses I quoted, this one probably comes up more than any other verse. And there's a reason for it, because I think it gets to the very heart of Christ and the very heart of the gospel. It's Philippians chapter 2. Paul is giving instructions to the Philippian church, and he's extolling them to be like Christ. So he says to them, do nothing from selfishness or empty ambition or conceit, but with humility of mind, regard one another as more important than yourselves. I just feel like there's so much we could summarize in Scripture of that passage. Our verse this morning, that don't regard one another as more important than yourselves. Do not merely look out for your own personal interests, but also for the interests of others. Have this attitude in yourselves, which was also in Christ Jesus. So again, it's not just be a good person, think of others, but you're following the example of Jesus Christ. So what was that? What did that look like? What was the example of Jesus Christ? What attitude did he have? It says, although he existed in the form of God, he did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped. So just think about that, because here's God, here's Jesus, right next to each other. Jesus is enjoying all the benefits of being God. And instead of saying, this is great, this is a good life, I'm sorry for those people that were created down there, but, they made their own mess. They got to deal with it. Instead, he did not regard it as a thing to be grasped, but he emptied himself of all of that. He took the form of a bondservant, of a slave, and being made in the likeness of men, and we celebrate that every Christmas, every year at Christmas, he came down in the likeness of men, not just men, but the most infant, the most fragile type of humanity, little baby. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself, became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. This is the humility of Christ. But we see our verse says that God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. And so Logan read for us this morning Luke 24, the resurrection account. We're finally going to get to see how this humility is tied into the resurrection account. So in Luke 24, which we read, so first of all, we have that whole reality that the crucifixion. Okay, Christ humbled himself to take on the form of man. That was humility enough for God. And yet he came down to the point of death. Okay, that's pretty humiliating. I mean, not just dying natural causes, but someone choosing to kill you. And then not just any death, but the most painful and the most shameful type of death imaginable, which was by crucifixion, by death on the cross. And it says, our verse in 1 Peter says, God is opposed to the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. So we see the humility of crucifixion, but we also see the gift of grace in the resurrection. And that's what we celebrate. That's what we're celebrating this morning. The gift of grace that comes from the humility. We also see in that Luke account that the humility of revealing the resurrection to women. The women went to go prepare his body get things ready for a proper burial. They had really just stuck him in there until they could bury him properly. They were going to go prepare his body and do the spices and all that stuff. And, in that time, a woman's testimony was not the great... If you're going to announce this grand thing that happened, like someone rising from the dead, like the Son of God coming back, you wouldn't do it through women. You would do it through his 12 disciples, probably Peter. You would do it like, hey, we want to get this out. Or maybe you'd do it through, the leaders of the temple. So they would get their attention and know. But no, who's the first ones to encounter this good news? It's the women. And there's a great humility in that. And the gift of grace also comes from that. Think about being in the women's shoes. They were the first ones to report the news of our risen Lord. God is opposed to the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. He raises them up and puts them in a position of beauty. We also see the humility when the women went to go deliver the message. They weren't believed. They were like, really? I'm not so sure about this. Did you get enough sleep last night? I'm not sure, were you at the right tomb? They were kind of, come on, really? I'm not sure this is true. But the grace within that is that even though they weren't believed, they still got to see it first. They got to see the reality of the resurrection. And they got to know that they know. And it didn't matter whether one believed them or not. If the disciples came and didn't believe them and were kind of like, oh, that's not a possibility, that did not change the fact that they knew what they saw. They did not question what they saw in their interactions they had with the angels who delivered the message to them. That is a gift of grace that they would take with them for the rest of their lives. And to be honest with you, part of the reason we have that in the Gospel of Luke is because as Luke came back years later and said, I want to get this in writing. I want to make sure I have an accurate account of all that happened to Jesus. He went back and interviewed and talked to these women. And these women remembered again how they went down there. Nobody believed them, but they were the first to see. They got the grace of that. Can you imagine every day when they encountered just a hard day and things weren't going well, and possibly even running into persecution as the church did moving forward, that they closed their eyes and thought back to that early Sunday morning at that tomb where they had the burial spices with them and it was empty. Imagine, dressing for a funeral and we usually send flowers and cards. Can you imagine that? Just bring a bouquet of flowers and we're all dressed in black and we've got our sympathy card and we're going to bring it and we show up at the funeral and there's no body there. Like, that's going to leave a mark on your life, right? And so that's the gift of grace that they had the whole rest of their life. So yeah, it started with humility. Nobody believed them when they came and told the story to the disciples, but they received the gift of grace. And then verse 12, and actually it goes the road to Emmaus even beyond, but we stopped at verse 12, and I did that for a reason, because here we have Peter. Peter said, I got to go see this for himself. Okay, that nobody believed the women, but he went to see. And it kind of leaves it unsatisfying in that passage in Luke 12. It's just like Peter went to see and he's like, you're right, there is no body here. And then they move on to the story. But, we know Peter, he's always trying to understand stuff. And I love the guy, he's a little impetuous sometimes, but he has a good heart. And he's just like, man, I don't know. He went to go see for himself. I can give him credit for that. But what's the gift of grace that he received? We see it. We've been looking at it. In this gospel, we've been looking at it for a year. The very beginning of this letter, he calls himself, an apostle of Jesus Christ. That's how he opens his letter. One sent out by Jesus Christ, by the living Jesus Christ. And even in this chapter, 1 Peter 5, he describes himself as a fellow elder. To all the different church elders among churches, he says, hey, I'm an elder among you. And he says, I'm a partaker of God's glory revealed. He says, I've witnessed the sufferings of Christ, but I'm also a partaker of the glory that's to be revealed. The glory of the risen Christ has been revealed to me. And that, now I get it. Now I understand. And so now here's the guy writing the letter we've been studying for a year. And we see him, before we see the humility of coming to the tomb that's empty, not understanding the story, but then coming around and finally getting it. So we do see that the humility of Christ leads to the exaltation of Christ. It is one and the same story. So I want to say our key verse, maybe put it in my own words. Say, likewise, in the same way, you younger in the faith, submit yourselves to the mature believers around you. All of you clothe yourselves with humility toward one another, because God battles against the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. And let me end with back our Philippians passage. I read this for you. This is verses 3 through 8. At this end, he humbled himself, became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. But that passage doesn't stop there. In verse 9, he continues, for this reason also, God highly exalted him. And he bestowed on him the name which is above every name, above any other name, so that at the name of Jesus, every knee will bow. Those who are in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. He has risen. He is resurrected, and every tongue, every knee, every person on this planet is going to acknowledge that at their judgment day. And the reality is that it is way better for us, just like our verse says, to acknowledge that before our judgment day. Just like the testimony my mom gave of my two aunts. To acknowledge Jesus as Lord brings great peace, even in the end of our life. when our body's falling apart, to know that Jesus Christ is Lord, to bow the knee, to confess with the tongue, brings great peace and comfort. And to not have that certainty, to not know or to reject God, brings great fear, as it should. Because the knee will be bowed. It will be either bowed by our choosing, or it will be bowed by force. Because God opposes the proud. So if we come to the Lord and say, I don't need your help, God. I'm good. I've got what I need. That's pride. And we will be fighting against God. But he gives grace to the humble. So the humility of Christ leads to the exaltation of Christ. The path of Christ, or to Christ, is through humility. It's the only way we can be saved, is that we humble ourselves and come to Christ through humility. And the hope and the life that we celebrate today in the resurrection comes through the humility of the cross. And so today we get to celebrate not just one versus the other, not just, I'm so glad we get through with that death stuff. We celebrate the whole story together. The humility of Christ leads to the exaltation.